Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Cassandra and I am an English tutor with Hack Your Course Tutoring. Today I'm going to help dissipate the cloud of confusion surrounding the upcoming GLA exams. I'm going to talk about how the test is formatted, and then I'm going to break down each component, and at the end of this presentation I'll give you some study tips. Let's begin. First of all, the GLA is the Graduated Literacy Assessment. It's important because it is going to be replacing the grade 12 provincial exams in British Columbia starting in 2019, so at the end of this next year. If you're thinking about literacy, what does it mean to be literate? Of course, literacy is the ability to make meaning from the things you read. So you see text on a screen and you know you're reading a sentence. What does the sentence mean in the greater scheme of things? That can be where it's tricky. So we do have one section here for the exam, which is the comprehension section. So that is asking those bigger questions. Why is this piece of text important? What is the meaning of it in terms of how it relates to society and the world at large? And the second part is communicating your understanding. So it's one thing to comprehend something, but can you make a personal connection to it? And can you write about it from your own worldview as well? So these are both equally rated, 50% for each. Now, the GLA is an online exam, so it has 5 components, which I'll be going over in this presentation. We have the pre-assessment activities, that's what you do before you get to the assessment. Then you have the essential question, that's the basically the whole idea of the quiz is this essential question. It's always going to be what you focus on. Then you have part A and part B, which one is the critical analysis and the other is the personal connection, which we saw right here. The final section is the self-reflection, which is just talking about how the test was for you. So this test can be taken in 3 formats. You can see there, one for English, one for French, and one for French immersion students. All inclusive. The first section of the GLA is the pre-assessment activities. These are the ways that you study prior to entering the exam. So depending on your personal style, you're either going to want to bounce ideas off of other people working in a group, or you're going to want to work on your own, either with the computer or at the library. But either way, what you want to do is focus on what has the most value. So if you look in part A, we have the analyzing and making meaning. There's selected response. I'll talk about selected response questions in the next slide. Then there is the graphic organizer. I'll also speak about that. And finally, there's the constructed response. So this is the essay that you'll write. So really, even though these are worth more, you know, individually, this is the one that holds the most weight because it is going to take the longest and it's going to take a little bit of organization. That's why you need the graphic organizer. So really your efforts should be on your writing just as much as they should be on your reading. The selected response questions are going to be about reading, like comprehension, and then these two are about essay writing. Looking over into part B, we have a similar value for analyzing and making meaning. So you'll have new texts and you'll have new questions, but then you also have a constructed response. So it's worth just as much as part A, but you don't have the graphic organizer. That's not to say you shouldn't make a draft though. You can follow the kind of format of a graphic organizer as you brainstorm what you'll write for part B. So the idea with the pre-assessment activities is to familiarize yourself with how the essay is going to be written and what kind of questions are going to be required, and then what everything is going to be worth so that you know how to study efficiently. As I said, the essential question is the focus for the entire assessment. So whether you're in part A, where you're critically analyzing texts in relation to the essential question, or you're in part B, where you're making personal connections to the text, the essential question is always rolling around in the back of your head. So that being said, it's going to be quite a broad question, and if you look on the right side of the screen, you can see some examples. So we have what are the benefits and consequences of questioning and or challenging authority. So it can be quite a controversial question. It's something that has a broad meaning. So when you're looking at those texts, it's really important in part A that you see what the authors are trying to say about this essential question. And then in part B, it's important that you make your personal connection to this. Maybe you have had an experience where you had to challenge authority, but it's important to be mindful that you don't confuse part A and part B. Part A, you're just analyzing the text in relation to the question. You're not adding your own personal experience. In part B, you have that opportunity. Once you have your essential question, you're going to begin part A, and part A is the connection and analyzation of texts. So if you look here, we have various different types of texts, and they're all real life examples. Like these are things you're going to come in contact with every day. Newspaper, magazine articles, social media feeds, you know, websites and brochures. But then you have some that you may not be familiar with, because in the past tests we would have things like novels or poetry or essays. But now we have things like maps and graphs and tables and charts, and these may be they may seem more difficult to connect to your essential question, because instead of quoting the author, you're going to be looking at the figures in the graphs or the layout of the map and seeing how that relates to the essential question. So it does require a slightly different type of literacy, and so when you are studying, it would be good to look at graphs and maps and try to analyze them in terms of, you know, for example, let's just say you had the question, how does isolation impact individuals? Well, if you had a map that showed you know, the roadways to different communities, you would be able to tell, well, an individual who's isolated in this map may not get the same resources as somebody in a city. If you had a graph that showed, you know, the visits to a hospital and maybe disease prevention, you might see how isolation can cause somebody to suffer more illnesses because they can't make it to the hospital and things like that. So it's a different kind of connection that you're going to make to the essential question than what would have been in the past. Part A is the analyzation and communicating of understanding about specific texts. So you'll be given a set of texts to analyze, and then you'll be asked some selected response questions. So don't worry, this is not a scary thing. These are just questions that have a correct answer. So we're all familiar with multiple choice, true or false questions, diagram labeling, things like that. I'm going to give you some other examples in the next slide. But basically there is a correct answer and you just have to find it, no problem. Now, what may be new for some people is the graphic organizer question. If you look on the right side of this page, we have a graphic organizer right here. And basically what this helps to do is to organize your thoughts for the short essay that you'll have to do at the end of this part of the assessment. So really it's an opportunity to just brainstorm your ideas. So when you're answering things like who wrote it, or who is it about, what is it about, when was it written, things like that, it really does help you to draft your small piece of writing for the end of part A. Now this is a critical analyzation, so you want to think deeply about things like, why was this text related to the essential question? Remember the essential question for your assessment. You want to connect the text to that greater idea. So if you had the question, what does isolation do to an individual, and then you have a text talking about the psychological damage that might happen to somebody who's not in contact with other people, you can kind of connect that to the greater idea of the essential question. I'll give you more examples towards the end of the presentation. are some different types of questions that you'll be asked on the GLA. Up at the top we have the selected response questions, which, as I mentioned, have a preordained answer. So remembering that this is an online test, we know that the format for the selected response questions may sometimes be new. For example, the hot spot, you'll select a desired spot on the screen. You can take your time with this slide to really familiarize yourself with the different types of questions here and how you will have to answer them, but there will be instructions on the screen as well, so you don't need to worry so much about not knowing what to do. There'll be instructions as you go through your exam. Down at the bottom we have the constructed response questions. So these are the longer answer questions. These are the questions where you are deciding what is the best answer to write. We already spoke about the graphic organizer. That's just a great way to bullet point show your understanding of the texts. And then, of course, you have the extended writing about the text. So the first one is for the A, this is the critical analysis. And then the second one is the B, part B, and that's the personal connection. So when you're writing part A, you have the graphic organizer to help you. And when you're writing part A, you are communicating your critical reading and understanding of the text as they relate to a specific facet of the essential question. I can't stress that enough. Depending on what the essential question is, you should really look at how those texts that you were given relate to it. Then when you have your part B, you can incorporate your personal connection, bring your own knowledge, your own experience, and your creative notions. So perhaps you have an idea or a solution for the problem that's shown in the texts. And this is in a piece of written communication that also relates to the essential question. So there's no doubt that the essential question is in part B as well. It's just that you have the opportunity to talk about your own views on it rather than just the text provided. Now we come to my favorite part of the assessment. This is analyzing texts and communicating a personal connection. It's very rare that you'll be asked to make a personal connection to texts in an academic setting. It's usually prohibited to even use the pronoun I in your writing. So really take this opportunity to dive deep into your personal views and analyze why you feel that way in relation to the text that you read. Now, keep in mind, you have a choice of the text that you're going to read. So I just want to reiterate here, though, each option features similar reading and communicating tasks. It takes the same amount of effort, so don't choose a set of texts because you think it will be easier. Neither of the sides are going to be easier. It's just based on your preference. In both options, you're going to still have selected response questions, just like in part A, and you're going to produce a piece of writing where you can make your personal connections. Always keeping in mind that critical, essential question. Let's look at the different options that we have. So first of all, there's the literacy for information. This is best for the readers who are maybe more analytical, you could say. You would prefer to read news articles or journal articles or maps and charts and infographics, things that are non-fiction. So if you prefer literacy for expression, then you're the kind of person who likes fiction or poetry. Science fiction is included in that. So you're going to want to read the novel or the poem or maybe even the blog post, the opinion piece, the social media topic as well. This is just the different kinds of text that you're going to see. It's basically artistic expression versus just simple information-based text. So choose based on your interests. I can't stress that enough. When you're writing your piece of writing, Even though you won't have a graphic organizer as you did in Part A, it is best to brainstorm your ideas before you start to write your essay. Just take a piece of scrap paper and just outline what your thesis is and your body paragraphs and your conclusion, because it'll be easier for you to organize your thoughts before you start writing, and then you can always look back to what you had as you go. Another portion of the assessment which sets it apart from the provincial exams is the self-reflection section. So this is an opportunity for you to think about your efforts in this exam, and mainly in your study efforts. I'm going to say this again and again, but how did you study? Did you set time apart for yourself? Did you take the right resources from your teacher? Did you ask the right questions? Did you have a study group? Did you go online? One major issue for a lot of my students is time management. So actually making yourself a study plan and following it. When you're reflecting on this assessment, you're also reflecting on the habits that you've created for yourself. So all of you are about to enter into a new stage of your life. You know, whether it's trade school or university or college, you're going to be having the same habits that you had in high school. So now is the time to make yourself an efficient studier. If you are somebody who doesn't have the time to study, like so many of my students have so many other activities, then you need to be studying efficiently. So you need to make yourself a strict plan where you're asking questions that get you thinking critically faster, so you can study less hours but still have the same results so long as the quality of your studying is there. The other thing is you get to reflect on the assessment itself, so you can provide feedback to the developers. So this is an opportunity for you to say, okay, the essential question wasn't broad enough, you know, it was too specific, or all of the texts used were biased. You know, you can say things like this to the developers so that in the future they'll make changes. That's not often the case with exams, as you well know. So take that opportunity to speak your mind. Speaking of studying, of course, we enter the actually practicing section. So naturally, when it comes to studying any kind of skill, there just is no magic pill. I wish I could give a potion to my students so that they would never have to study again, but then I would be out of the job. So what I have here for you is a website with 100 awesome essential questions. So these are questions that are similar to what you'll see on the assessment so that you can study on your own time. And this would be studying in the pre-assessment section of the GLA. So when you're looking at these essential questions, you can form your own studying with them basically by compiling texts. So you might see an essential question like that isolation question that I've returned to a couple of times, and you might see some blog posts or some social media texts that you could analyze on your own. So this will require a little bit of research, but not much, because really you can study 2 or 3 texts per essential question. You don't have to go crazy, but you can study a few different kinds of essential questions. And also you can get resources from your teachers. Teachers will always have a set study plan for you, so follow it. And that is part of preparing yourself for this exam. The other thing that I have here is my favorite website for grammar and reading comprehension tasks. It's called englishforeveryone.org. And it's just a great place where you can practice quizzes and increase your reading and grammar. And of course, this is without the pressure of a real exam. So when you're studying, yeah, actually, you know what? Maybe that's the magic of it. The magic of studying is to be in a relaxed stage. So to be in a place where there's no distractions, to be in a space that you've created where you know you have to focus on studying, and to make your studying count. So really plan out what you're going to do and stick to that plan. You know, if you have 20 minutes of reading and then 30 minutes of answering questions, that is a great way to prepare yourself for this exam, because it fits the format and it allows you to gain those skills, because of course repetition is the key to studying. So when you're using repetition as a key, what you're doing is you're looking over old quizzes that you took, or you're looking at questions that you got wrong and seeing how you can retake them or remember why they are the way they are, why you got them wrong, and what you can do to get them better the next time. So repetition, 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 and also just the efficiency of your studying. Make a plan and stick to it, as I said. Before I leave you, I did want to give you kind of a sample assessment, something you might see on one of these GLAs. Now, I could find 0 examples. I couldn't find any examples on the BC Ministry website or on any other websites that I searched on. So I'm assuming that as we near the 2019 mark, more documents will arrive, more plans will arrive, and it's just a matter of time. However, I made a sample assessment for you guys, so this one may not be exactly the format because, of course, I've just cut and pasted pieces of writing from larger works, but this is the idea. So it's not going to look like this, but it's going to be similar text chosen. So the first thing we want to look up is the essential question, of course. So we have here, how do we decide if the world as it is today is better or worse than it was in the past? So it's a broad question. It's something you can brainstorm about just with your own thinking for the part B. But what I have here is the part A section. So these would be the texts for the analysis, the critical analysis of the text and how they relate to the essential question. So the first text is a address to the UN. This is from Emma Watson. Then we have a website, The Changing Views Towards Women in the 18th Century. We have a blog post, What It's Like to Be a Woman in Tanzania. And then we have a journal article, and this is Women in Politics in Africa. So I'm not going to read these out. You can read them for yourself, but you can see they're all different types of texts that would be used, and they all have to do with how women are treated today and how they were treated in the past. So if you think about your essential question, how do we decide if the world today is better or worse than it was in the past, then you can see why these texts were chosen. So that's something you might think about. They all relate to women, but they all have something specific to do with equality. So that's what I focus on in the next slide. As I mentioned before, the graphic organizer is a great way to draft your essay. After parts A and part B, you will have to write a piece of writing. And so this is just a great way to structure and brainstorm your ideas so that you can write your essay fluidly without having to think about what you want to say next. So when you're crafting your argument, you want to keep 2 things in mind. First, you want to think of the essential question. So we had, how do we decide if today's society is better or worse than it was in the past? And then you have to also keep in mind what the texts are about. So we're lucky in this example, all of them are centered around women's equality. So that's both in today's society and in the 18th century. So the past and the present, just like our essential question. The thesis statement is coming straight out of the evidence from those texts, and this says, although significant progress has been made, many women still face prejudice and inequality, and this is thinking globally, right? We're thinking about today's society as a global society. That's why we have the comparison of the women in America and Britain and the women in Africa. So without getting too much into the organizer here, we'll move on to the draft, and that's the next slide. As I mentioned, that organizer becomes the form for your essay. So returning back to the essential question, how do we decide if the world today is better or worse than it was in the past? You can see how my thesis is formed with this question in mind. So the thesis becomes, by reviewing something as important as female equality in society, we can measure the overall quality of society. So then you move into your body paragraphs and you have the different views, right? You have the view of female equality in the Western society, both in the past and present. Then you have the female equality in the African society, past and present. Now the conclusion I've written out. I haven't written out the other sections of this, but I think you can see where I'm going based on my organizer. So while circumstances have improved for women in the West, drastically women in Africa are still valued as mothers rather than individuals. One could say that the world today is better than it once was, since the general trend is towards equality, yet no one can deny the clear differences between countries. Since we live in a global society, there can be no true equality until everyone benefits. Therefore, we must judge whether today's society is better than in the past based on how people are treated around the globe. So again, we have connected that greater question, that essential question, with the texts that we received. So all the texts that we received were about female equality. So naturally, your essay has to focus on this because it's critically analyzing those texts. And when you're writing your body paragraphs, I should have mentioned you should use quotes, of course. You should use quotes from the different texts, so that you can see where you're getting your information and your ideas. This is not the section where you're making a personal connection. This is the section where you're critically analyzing those texts and how they relate to the essential question. So use quotes and relate it to the essential question once again. Thank you all for taking the time to watch this video and prepare yourself for the GLA. Some of the final thoughts I wanted to leave you with, of course, I want you to study smart. So set time aside for your studying. Make sure you have a plan. Stick to your plan and really prepare yourself so that when you enter that exam, it's almost like you've overtrained. You know how marathon runners, they overtrain so that when they come to the marathon, it's just an easy day run. No big deal. That's how an exam should feel for you. That's what studying is for. Studying is not to torture you, it's so that when it comes to an exam like this, you are well prepared, over-prepared. When you're brainstorming and organizing, bounce ideas off of your classmates. If your style is more extroverted, then you will thrive on a team. When you're studying together and forming ideas together, then you're better able to feel comfortable when you're alone in the exam, because you can think, oh, what did we discuss as a team? Okay, now I can put those plans into effect. When you're organizing your thoughts, use the graphic organizer, use the draft idea before you begin those pieces of writing in parts A and parts B. One thing I also wanted to mention, it's not often stated, but it should be said again and again, is stay healthy. Sleep enough, eat more than enough. Your brain requires so much glucose during an exam, it's incredible, so eat lots of food. And also, you know, some of my students, they've made themselves sick with stress. When you stress about an exam, it can just cause your health to plummet. I know I personally have had an experience where I had to cancel a math exam because I was so ill, and it was just a day flu that happened because of my test anxiety. So stay healthy in the way that you know best. If you know that you need extra sleep, get extra sleep. The final thing is, of course, to focus. So what I mean by that is when you come to the exam, set 10 minutes aside to turn your phone off completely, sit still, think about what's going to be expected of you, visualize writing the exam, visualize, writing your essay, and have that space available to you for when you enter into the exam. So your entire focus is just on the current task. It's not on your day-to-day life. It's just on the assessment. So thank you again and again for listening and taking the time to prepare yourself in this manner. I wish you all the best on your GLA and for your future.